Alright, hello everybody. We're at Roman numeral 8. Roman numeral 8, the Atlantic slave trade. Okay? The Atlantic slave trade. This is the final part of this this puzzle of understanding how the Americas became populated by Europeans and Africans. Okay, so let's talk about this Atlantic slave trade and how that all came about. Alright, letter A under Roman numeral 8 is slavery in Africa. First point I want to make is that slavery has existed in Africa throughout recorded history. Okay, the first concept of slavery in Africa did not come when the Europeans came there looking for slaves to work plantations in the Americas. That was actually very, very late in the whole development of this idea of slavery. So slavery has been around ever since history has been recorded. In fact, if you read in the Bible, you can read about the enslavement of the Israelites by an African group called the Egyptians. Okay, so slavery is nothing new in Africa. It's been around since as far as anybody can remember. In addition to that, slavery has been around in the Americas. American Indians enslaved each other, and slavery existed sort of in Europe. It was called serfdom. Okay, I talk a little bit about that in World Civ 1. It is not exactly slavery, but it is a form of unfree labor. It's a form of people who are forced, required to work for the service of someone else without any kind of a financial compensation. So slavery not only is an African institution that's been around forever, slavery is a worldwide institution. Okay, so when we think about slavery, don't think that it started when Europeans began looking for people to work their plantations in the Americas. Slavery has always existed in Africa. Letter B, the Arab slave trade. Now, while slavery did exist in Africa before Europeans or anybody else really got involved in that part of the world, the first people to enslave and export Africans as slaves, okay? Export means take them away from their homeland, okay? To take people away from Africa were the Arabs. Arabs began enslaving Africans in the 700s. Okay, in the idea of Arab slavery, Africans were enslaved. There were really people were given a choice as the Arab world expanded in this Islamic empire spread across northern Africa. The folks that were conquered were given a choice. You can either A, convert and become a Muslim, B, you could die in battle. That's always an option. Or C, you were enslaved by the Arab Muslims. Okay, so those were the three options. Everybody who was conquered by these Arab empires fell into one of those three categories. So the first group of folks to export African people as slaves were not Europeans taking them to the Americas. They were Arabs taking them to the Arab Peninsula. That started around 700 and it lasted into the 1900s, and we can estimate that about 5 million African people were enslaved by the Arabs and taken from Africa. Okay, about 5 million over a period of 1,200 or so years. Okay, all right. Letter C, chattel slavery. This is a key term. This is the definition that I need you to know. Okay, so what chattel is. To define the term chattel, chattel is movable property. That's the very short definition, but it doesn't necessarily make it very clear to you, does it? What movable property is, this is something that is owned completely and can be done with whatever the owner chooses. Okay, now, as something that is not movable property would be something like real estate. Okay, that was the key form of wealth among Europeans, okay, was real estate, owning land. If you own land, you have a very good source of wealth. That's still true today throughout the world. Okay, so slaves are chattel. That means they're movable property. That means they're owned. Okay, but unlike real estate, unlike chattel, cannot be moved. Okay, you own it, you can do what you want with it, but you can't move it. Okay, the best way to look at slavery, sadly, is as if it were if these human beings were like livestock to their owners. Okay, So in chattel slavery, what you have is you have someone who owns everything about that human being. They own all of their labor. They own all of their creativity. They own all of their knowledge. They own all of even their reproduction. So if if two slaves, unite in physical relationship and have children, the resulting child is the property of the owner of that slave. It usually goes in the form of the mother, in case the mother and the father are not owned by the same person. Okay, that's different from previous forms of slavery, and this chattel slavery is new by the 1500s. Okay, this is a new form of slavery that is kind of the creation of these Europeans who are looking for slaves to work on their plantations in the Americas. Okay, chattel slavery started around 1500 as the Europeans began exploiting African people for their labor. Not only was their labor, they were totally owned their entire lives. With chattel slavery comes a slave trade. Okay, slavery does not necessarily have to involve a slave trade. People throughout history have been owned by others. Their labor has been totally controlled and exploited by others. That doesn't mean that that other person could actually sell the slave. Okay, after 1500, with the Americas, with the Atlantic slave trade, that is the Europeans purchasing slaves in Africa and taking them to the Americas to work on plantations. That's where we see the first chattel slavery. So chattel is a new kind of slavery that comes at this time period and involves Europeans and Africans. However, slavery is not a new idea as a whole, just chattel slavery. Okay, so you got chattel slavery. Letter D, the American colonies. Now, you don't hear much about slaves being, acquired by Europeans in Africa and taken back to work in Europe. Usually what happens in this whole slave trade thing is that Africans were enslaved by Europeans and taken to work on plantations in the American colonies. Remember, I talked the other day about how the Spanish had American colonies, the Portuguese had American colonies, the French had American colonies, the English had American colonies, and the Dutch had American colonies. Okay, all those colonies are money makers for their mother countries. Okay, so those people who were enslaved in Africa were taken to these American colonies. This whole African slave trade that has become such a huge part of history, such a sad part of history, would not have existed had not the Europeans created these colonies in the Americas. Of course, that all started with Christopher Columbus and his so-called discovery. Discovery is really a poor word for that, but his first travels to the Americas. Okay. Letter E, sugar. That is the crop I've been talking about for so long. Sugar. Slaves became their labor was exploited on sugar plantations long before cotton even was a profitable crop in the Americas. Okay, usually when we think about slaves, we think about cotton field agriculture and things like that. True, absolutely. In Mississippi especially, that was the big crop. But that does not come about early in the slave trade. It comes out really very, very late. The first crop that really is the big money maker is sugar. Now, sugar is a tropical crop. It has to be very hot weather in order for sugar to grow. Places like those Caribbean islands, today the country of Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, those are all good places to grow sugar. And the Europeans who owned or claimed these different islands established huge sugar plantations throughout them. Okay, and one other place where sugar turns out to be extremely profitable is in Brazil. You remember the Portuguese, they claimed Brazil but did very little with it for about 100 years. Not until they discovered the profitability of sugar agriculture did the Portuguese really take hold of Brazil and start doing something with it. Okay, now I'm going to have to stop there. I'll talk more about sugar on the next video.